Hello and welcome to Deploying and Consuming Serverless Functions with AWS Amplify. This webinar is going to be a combination of slides and demo. So we're going to go over some ideas around how building these serverless functions with Amplify, how that looks, comparing it to other ways of building serverless applications. And then we're going to kind of look at how to actually implement a serverless function as well as an API in front of API gateway using Amplify and a React application. So my name is Nader Dabbit. I'm a developer advocate on the mobile team, and I've been working with AWS Amplify really for about a year and a half. You can follow me on Twitter at Dabbit3, and feel free to reach out to me after this webinar. I'd be happy to help answer any questions you might have. So the agenda for today is we're going to first look at the different options that you have for AWS Lambda, because along with Amplify, there are many other options. We're going to kind of then compare and contrast how Amplify differs from those other options. And we're going to also do an overview of Amplify, as well as a quick overview of AWS Lambda. We're going to then jump into a demo. We're going to create, update, and show how to remove and delete Lambda functions from the Amplify CLI. We're going to look at how to invoke the Lambda functions from a web application through API gateway. And then we're going to also look at how to invoke these functions locally from your command line so you can test these out without even having to hit the API. We're also going to look at how to work with multiple environments. And then we're going to look at how to delete the entire project when we're done. So all the infrastructure that we create, we're going to look at how to delete that using the Amplify CLI. So building with AWS Lambda, there are quite a few options now. So in addition to AWS Amplify, there's the Serverless Framework, which works not only with AWS, but with other cloud providers as well. So you can do stuff with Azure as well as GPC and I believe one other provider. There's Terraform and SAM, and there's CloudFormation. And I would kind of bucket these three into similar categories in the sense that you're writing a lot of boilerplates, and a lot of this boilerplate is kind of like configuration infrastructure as code. And then you can actually just deploy them directly through the AWS Console. So you can go in, write your code, upload zip files if you'd like, and then deploy directly there. And then there's quite a few third-party providers that are out there now. A couple of the more popular ones that I know of are Claudia and Apex. And so there are quite a few more in addition to those. But the top 6 that I'm listed here seem to be kind of the most popular ones. So working with AWS Amplify and in particular with Lambda with Amplify, I'm going to talk about kind of how that looks. So first of all, the Amplify CLI is what we're going to be doing to create these resources. So the resource creation is CLI based, even though Amplify also has a couple of other features that are not CLI based. So for instance, we have the client, which allows you to connect to these different backends and services that we're going to be creating from your mobile app or your web application. And then we also have the Amplify Console, which allows you to deploy web applications. So we have both client and backend tooling with Amplify. The Amplify API and Amplify Function features only work with AWS. So while with other Amplify client features like the GraphQL client, you can actually use that with other cloud providers. What we're looking at today only works with AWS. And the Amplify CLI uses CloudFormation under the hood. And Amplify CLI and Amplify in general is a really easy entry point for people looking to get into serverless, because you don't really have to know a lot about AWS to get started. We're not using a lot of jargon and lingo and acronyms compared to what you might see with the Serverless Framework or some of these other different providers for building these serverless functions. So Amplify uses these categories that are more along the lines of what is actually being done. So we have categories like authentication. We have categories like functions. So what we're saying what they are versus giving the actual the actual service name. And then the CLI allows you not only to create serverless functions, but you have to actually interact with these functions in some way. So we're going to be interacting with them through an API gateway event. So we need to create an API URL and then have the URL invoke the function once we hit it from a client-side application. So through the CLI, we'll create both the API gateway and the Lambda function and kind of hook the two together. So the Amplify framework consists of, again, of a CLI client libraries. So we have support for not only JavaScript, but native iOS and Android. And we also have framework support for many of the most popular JavaScript frameworks. We also have the console, which allows you to deploy and host your web applications. We have pre-built UI components for these other JavaScript frameworks like React, React Native, Vue, and Angular. We have a tool chain that does code generation along with a few other things. And I did already talk about this framework support. And then we also have the client SDK a little bit more in depth. We'll look at this. So when you're working with AWS services, a lot of times from the JavaScript side, you've used the AWS JavaScript SDK. Well, the Amplify JavaScript client is similar to the AWS JS SDK, but it's a little more opinionated. It's very client focused. So this isn't something you would use on a server, for example. You wouldn't really use the AWS Amplify client on a server. So you wouldn't probably have a lot of benefit out of doing that. We have even more high-level abstractions than what you've seen in the AWS JavaScript SDK. And we kind of go ahead and bundle in all of the best practices so you can kind of get going without having to understand a lot of those best practices yourself. The best practices are simply just baked into the features, into the service. And then the Amplify JavaScript client can be used without the CLI, but it is kind of built with the CLI in mind. So it's when you're working with the Amplify client, you're going to be using things that are part of this AWS exports configuration file that you can populate yourself, but the CLI will actually populate that for you and kind of keep it up to date with all of the different services that are there. So you don't really have to do any configuration on the client as far as your services are concerned. So with the CLI, you can create, update, and delete cloud services. The CLI works with multiple serverless environments. So you can create a main environment, deploy an entire stack. You can deploy Auth, API, DynamoDB, all that stuff. And then you can actually create a new environment that will clone that existing environment, deploy the whole stack, make changes, and then merge your changes that were not part of the original stack into the original stack, and then kind of delete your development stack. So you can kind of create these feature deployments that allow you to kind of test things out without affecting your main environment. We have GraphQL Transform and GraphQL CodeGen also built in. Doesn't really apply much to serverless functions, but it's kind of good to know. The Amplify CLI supports quite a few categories. What we're going to be looking at today is API and serverless functions, but as you can see, we support quite a few others. To work with the CLI, this is kind of a typical flow. You'll be inside of the root of the project that you're working in, and then you can run these Amplify commands to kind of start creating and managing services. So to add a new service, you would run Amplify add in the name of the service. That would allow you to kind of walk through some configuration locally. When you're ready to deploy the new service, you can run Amplify push. When you need to make changes, you can run Amplify configure in the name of the service. And then when you're ready to remove any feature that you already have enabled, you can just run Amplify remove in the name of the feature. And then finally, if you want to delete an entire project, Amplify delete will delete the entire project, not only locally, but it will also delete all of the backend services as well. Amplify multiple environments has an env command. So you can run Amplify env and create, configure, and work with your local environments. This is kind of a quick look at how that looks. If we have time at the end of this, we're going to actually demo this. So the Amplify client allows you to interact with the services that you've created from the CLI. So for instance, we're going to be creating a REST API and a serverless function using the CLI. We're going to then use the client to consume that API. To use the Amplify client, you install it via npm. So we'll say npm install AWS Amplify, and these will have all these different APIs as part of the Amplify library. Some of those APIs are auth, storage, analytics, XR, and the API category itself, which is what we're going to be using to interact with our REST API. Once you've imported the class that you'd like to work with, so here we import the API class, we can then start using that directly in our JavaScript project. So this is the way that we would call a get command on a REST API. So here we have api.get. We pass in 2 arguments, the path and the API name. And this will return a promise, and we'll look at how to actually implement this in just a moment. We support native iOS, native Android out of the box with Amplify, and we also have native JavaScript support, or we have framework-specific support for React, React Native, Vue, Angular, Ionic. So let's look at how we might deploy a Lambda function with API Gateway using the Amplify framework. I'm going to walk through the slides, and we're going to actually do this ourselves. So first of all, you would open up the project that you're in, and you would run Amplify add, and you would say function, or whatever service you'd like. In this case, it would be function. This will go ahead and create a new function and walk you through a few different steps. And then once the function's been created, we then want to put an API gateway in front of it. So we want to be able to connect to that function via an API URL. To do that, we run Amplify add API. This will walk us through a few steps, and then it will allow us to connect our function that we created earlier to this API endpoint. So that is going to be done from the CLI for us. We're given a few different API options. The API option that we're going to go with is REST. You can also choose GraphQL, which will then work instead with AWS AppSync, but we're not really interested in that. We're looking to work with API Gateway and a REST API. So after we've created the Lambda function, we're going to have some code that's been generated for us in this folder here called amplify/backend/function. And this will be all of the functions that we've created. And then we'll have a source folder containing our actual source code. So in app.js, we'll be able to make changes to the different endpoints that we have created for us. So for instance, if we have an app.get/items, we can go in there, change our code, and make updates. And then after we've written our code, we want to deploy the new updated function or the new function, we can run Amplify push. And then the flow goes very similarly for updating and deploying new functions. You go into the app.js, or you go into your serverless function project, the folder, and you go in there, you make your changes, and then to deploy new changes, you just run Amplify push again. So after we've deployed our function and our API, to interact with it from the client, we're going to import the API category or the API class from AWS Amplify. We can then call api.get, passing in the API name as well as the endpoint, and this is going to return some data. It's going to return a promise, so we can either do .then or we can say async await, and either one of those would work. And that's about it. So let's take a look at what Lambda actually, is, or kind of how it works in a very short summary. So with Lambda, you're able to run code without provisioning or manage servers. So when they say serverless, of course there are still servers, just that you don't have to deal with the managing, updating, patching, or just maintenance of these servers. They're kind of managed for you. Just like how wireless phones do have wires at some point in the communication line, you don't have to deal with those wires. That's the same thing that's going on with serverless. The servers are there, you just don't have to deal with them. And instead of paying for the actual servers themselves, you're only paying for the execution time of the compute time that you're actually working with. So you're now paying for compute time, which means that if your Lambda function isn't being invoked, you're not paying anything for the functionality being there. You're kind of paying only for actual usage. These Lambda functions will dynamically scale for you. As long as you have the Lambda function deployed, the scaling is handled for you. And it's basically done in response to the increase in traffic that you're going to have to your Lambda function. And Lambda functions are event-based. And so when you deploy a Lambda function, you can invoke these functions in multiple different ways. You don't have to only invoke these via an API gateway, which we're going to look at. You can also do so through other Lambda functions, for example. So if you have another Lambda function, you can invoke that function from within another Lambda function using the AWS SDK. You can also invoke Lambda functions via DynamoDB. So if you put something in DynamoDB, you can invoke a function. You can invoke these from S3 uploads. So a lot of different AWS servers services allow you to invoke Lambda functions. But the way we're going to be looking at today is API gateway. So a Lambda function typically has a handler function. And the handler is going to be what you specify in the Lambda function definition as the entry point. And the handler is a function that takes in 2 arguments. And these arguments are going to contain the event and the context. So we kind of name those typically event and context as the first and second argument. The event has all the information about the function's event. So if you pass in any data as an event body, for example, or you pass in any arguments, all of that is going to be available on the event. You'll also have information about the user. For instance, if you have an authenticated API, you'll have user information about that authenticated user available on the event. And then the context has the execution context. And to return data from your Lambda function, what we're using is Node.js 8 and above. And using Node.js 8 and above, you can just simply return a response from your Lambda function. And this is kind of what gets returned to the caller. So what we're looking at here is an example where we might have a Lambda function that calls another API. So here we have an async function. So we're able to say async and then await. So we're saying we're awaiting some random API call. Once that is returned, we store that in a variable called data. We create a new response object that has a status code and a body. We pass the data as a body, and then we just return that entire object back to the caller. And this is kind of a very basic definition of what a Lambda function typically would look like. So now let's take a quick look at a demo. So what we're going to do is we're going to start from a brand new React application. We're going to create a serverless function. We're going to create an API gateway. We're going to interact with the function locally. We're going to then update the function to add authentication so we can look at how to add an authenticated API. And then finally, we're going to also look at how to call other APIs from within a Lambda function. So I'm going to go to my command line, and from here, we're going to go ahead and, let's see here. Yeah, from here, we're going to go ahead and start writing some code. So again, I'm here inside of a new React application. So nothing going on here. The first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and install AWS Amplify and AWS Amplify React. So AWS Amplify is going to be what we use to call the API using the API category. And then AWS Amplify React is what we're going to use to add an authentication flow in front of our API because we're going to be using a WidthAuthenticator component, which allows us to scaffold up authentication fairly quickly. That way we can test out an authenticated endpoint. So in our React application, we're going to run Amplify init. This will initialize a new AWS Amplify project. Here we're going to be walked through a couple of different questions. A name for the project, I'll call this Amplify Lambda. A name for the environment, we can call this local. Our text editor, the type of app we're building, and the framework. And then the rest of these, I can just choose the default since it'll detect all of that for us. And then we're going to be asked for our AWS profile, and I'm going to choose US East 1. For me, that's the default profile. So this is going to go ahead and deploy the base Amplify project. So once we've deployed our base Amplify project, we can start adding new services to it. This is going to go ahead and deploy 2 things, a CloudFormation stack and an S3 bucket. When we're done with this project, we can then run Amplify delete again to kind of delete all of these services. But whenever we run Amplify init, that's what's going on. We're creating that CloudFormation stack, and then we're also creating the S3 bucket. After that's successful, you'll get a little command or a little output that says initialize your environment successfully. After your environment has been initialized, you should now see an Amplify folder, and then you should also see a aws-exports.js file in your source directory. So from here, we can now say Amplify add and start adding different services. So the first thing we'll add is a function. So we'll run Amplify add function, and this is going to be our first serverless function. So now we can, it's asking us for a name for our resource. So we want this to be our main app Lambda. I'll just call it something like that. This is because we're going to be using this Lambda function for a few different things, so I don't want to give it a single name. We're going to be having an endpoint for people, an endpoint for items, so I want to kind of make it pretty generic. So main app Lambda, and the Lambda function name is going to be the same, so we're going to have a reference to it locally as well as the actual Lambda function name. We're given a couple of options for boilerplates, so it's going to kind of give us a way to kind of start off with something so we can have some code to work with. We have the option between a hello world function, which is very similar to what I showed you in the slide where we have an exports.handler. We also have the option for a CRUD function, which basically will scaffold out some DynamoDB CRUD operations for things like create, update, delete, all of that stuff. And then what we're going to actually choose is the serverless express function, because we're going to be choosing to integrate with API Gateway later anyway. And this will actually scaffold out a pretty nice boilerplate for us to have different endpoints available, and kind of it'll already kind of build all that for us and kind of give us something nice to get started with. Now we're given the option to edit the local function locally. So this is going to scaffold out the function, and we can either just deploy it as is, or we can go ahead and open it and take a look at it and edit it. Let's go ahead and take a look at it. I'm going to choose yes. And this should now open up the Lambda function in your text editor. So I'm going to go ahead and delete some comments, and we're going to kind of walk through some of the Lambda boilerplate that we're given. Again, this is kind of just some boilerplate, so you don't really need all of this. But what I'll show you is we have this new folder in our backend folder called function, and this is going to list all of our functions. The function that we're in right now is the main app Lambda. In this, we have our source folder with all of our source code. So we have the app.js and the index.js. If we look at index.js, it looks very similar to that other function we looked at earlier where we have an exports.handler. The main difference is this is going to actually proxy a express server and allow us to write our code in app.js, and it's going to pass in all of the different endpoint API calls here. So that way we're able to kind of have this express server running, and we can then use it to kind of take advantage all of what you would have in an express application. And essentially all this does is it allows us to easily add different endpoints, so we can have different operations for get, put, update, post, delete, all of these CRUD or these REST calls that we're used to working with. It kind of goes ahead and creates them for us. So let's kind of think about the first API we want to create. Let's create a people API where we can say we want to get an endpoint called /people, and we want to return maybe some data that we're going to be fetching from another API later. But for now, we can go ahead and hard code it. So let's have an array of people, and here we're going to go ahead and create a few people that we're going to have a name and an age. Okay, so we have this array of people, and this endpoint is going to be what we're going to be hitting at first to kind of test this thing out. So whenever we hit this endpoint, we want to return some data, and to do that, we can call res.json, so response.json, and here we have in the function argument a request and a response argument. So the request is going to be things that are passed into the function. So here we have the request.api gateway event, I think it's called. And we also have the request.API gateway context. So I mentioned earlier that we have the event and the context available to us in the function arguments. We still have those here. They're just now available in this API gateway events or API gateway context argument. So they're both available on the request. And then if we did pass in a body, we could then access that off the request body. So that's what's going on in the request. And then the response is kind of what we're going to be using to return back to the function. So here we say response.json. So we're going to return a JSON response with whatever we'd like to respond with here. So what I want to call is response.json with the success message and then also this people array. Okay, so we have the people array, hard-coded people, and the endpoint we're working with is slash people. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and save this file, and we'll jump back to the command line, and we're going to press enter. And now we see that the Lambda function was successfully created locally for us. So now that we have the Amplify function created, we can run Amplify status to see a list of all the different services that we've created so far. And here we're going to see that we've created a function, and then the operation is set to create. The operation is what's going to happen the next time that you run Amplify push. So in the future, you might have multiple categories enabled, and the operations could vary between create, update, or no operation. So depending on what you're doing, that's kind of what the operations will look like. So now that we have the function created, let's add an API gateway endpoint for that. So to do that, we can run amplify add API. And here we're going to be walked through a couple of steps. We're going to choose the REST API as the type of API we'd like to create. For the name of the resource, we're going to call this main app API. For the path, we're going to choose a path of /people because we already created that /people endpoint. And now we can choose the Lambda function that we've already created, and it's going to go ahead and give us that Lambda function here, so we can go ahead and choose that. And now we're given the option to restrict API access. So we're going to choose no because right now we don't have authentication enabled yet. And do we want to add another path? We're going to go ahead and choose no. So now we have the new API endpoint created for us. We also have the Lambda function created. So let's go ahead and deploy both of these, and then we're going to look at how to interact with these from our React application. So to do that, we'll run amplify push. This will go ahead and prompt us to make sure that we'd like to continue with the creation of these two resources. We'll choose yes, and this will go ahead and deploy our backend. So this might take about a minute or so. So while that's happening, let's jump back to our React application and begin the configuration of that React application. So we can now open app.js and index.js to start working with our API in just a moment. So to do so, we first need to let our React application know about our Amplify project, because we created that Amplify project, and this AWS exports file here that's created in our source folder, this is going to now be populated with a bunch of key value pairs about the services that we're creating. So once that AWS exports file is populated, which will happen when the creation process is done, we need to import that here, and that's going to be how we configure our application to kind of let React know about Amplify. So to do that, we're going to first import Amplify from AWS Amplify. We're going to then import the configuration from that AWS exports file. And then we can finally just call amplify.configure, and we'll just pass in the config that we imported. So that's, again, at the root. So I did that in index.js. We import Amplify, we import the config, and we call amplify.configure. So I'm going to go ahead and save that, close that, and jump back to app.js because we don't really need index.js. We only needed it to do that initial configuration. And I'm going to go ahead and delete the bad semicolons, and we're going to continue on here. So to interact with our API, we're going to be working with the API category. So to import the API category, we can just import that here from AWS Amplify. And then API is going to have all of these different methods. So we can call API.get, API.post, API.put, etc. And those are going to be interacting, again, with that app.js server that we have created, where we have get, we also have post and put for these other endpoints. But the only endpoint that we have configured right now is the people endpoint. So this is going to be the one we're working with. So we'd like to hit this endpoint, and we would like to get this data back in the API call. So let's look at how to do that. So in React, we need to go ahead and import UseEffect, which is a way to call functions or to make API calls when the component loads. It's kind of like the old component did mount from React classes. So in the function definition, we're going to call UseEffect, and this is going to be where we kind of make that API call. So we're going to create a new function called call API. And we're going to make this an async function because we want to do a try catch block with async await. So we'll say try catch. And here in this try catch block, we're going to call API.get. And here we're going to pass in two arguments, the API name and then the actual path that we're working with. So the path is /people because that's the path that we specified. And the API name is going to be here in our API category. It's going to be the main app API. So I can just say main app API. And here we're going to go ahead and store the value of this API call as maybe just data. And this is going to need to be an await. We're going to do async and then await. And then after this data comes back, for now, we'll just go ahead and log this out. And then in this function here, we can call API. And we'll just make sure this only gets called once. So we'll pass in that second argument as the array, empty array. So call API, we'll call API.get, passing in the API name and the endpoint. Once that returns, we'll log out the data. And then for the function, for the main component app, when this gets run, we'll call this UseEffect lifecycle hook or this UseEffect hook. We'll call API, and we'll just log out the data. So let's go ahead and save that. And we're going to jump back to our command line to kind of make sure that our deployment was successful. And if it was, you should see all resources are updated in the cloud, and now we should be ready to go. So to test this out, I'm going to go ahead and run npm start. And this is going to go ahead and kick off our React application. And then I'm going to open our React application in the browser at localhost 3000. All right, so after our React application loads, I'm going to go ahead and right-click and click Inspect to go ahead and check out the developer console. And from the developer console, here's where we're going to see the data that was logged out for us from the API call. So here you'll notice that we do have this data object, and we have the success message as well as the array of people. And you'll see that we do indeed get all of the data back where we have the person's age, their name, and we see that we have Jennifer, Chris, and Amanda all coming back. So that was successful. Let's go ahead and go back to our React application and look at how to add another API call to kind of extend what we already have going on in our Lambda function. So really what I want to do is instead of this API call calling people and just returning some hard-coded data, what we want to do is we want to make another HTTP request from within our Lambda function. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and change into this actual directory where we have our Lambda function, and we're going to install an HTTP request library called Axios. You can also polyfill node fetch if you like, or you can use whatever HTTP library you like. So we're going to install that, and then we're going to be able to call a third-party external API to fetch some data. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead into my terminal and change into the directory that we're going to be working with. So we're going to be going into Amplify, and from here we're going to be going into backend function and then the name of the function that we're working with. So for us, that's Amplify backend function main app Lambda. So our source code is going to be located in that source directory. And from here, we can now start installing dependencies that we want to deploy the next time we run Amplify push. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say npm install, or you can use yarn add, either one, Axios. So it's AXIOS. And this is going to be the package that we're going to be using to make HTTP requests. So now that we've installed Axios, I'm going to go back to my React project, and I'm going to go into this Amplify folder and open up the app.js that we used before. And what we're going to do is we're going to now go ahead and import or require the Axios library that we just installed. And now we're going to be able to use Axios to make other HTTP requests. So from within this app.get, let's go ahead and change this up a little bit. And what we want to do now is we want to call axios.get. And then this is where we're going to be calling the endpoint that we want to work with. The endpoint that I'm going to be calling is the Star Wars API, because it's a free and open API that doesn't require any authentication or anything like that. So it's a pretty good API to use, and it's wsapi.co. And the endpoint that I'm going to be using is /people, and this is going to return some people data for us to also use similarly to what we did before. So I'm going to say axios.get, and then this returns a promise, and it also returns an error if there is an error. So we're going to say .then, and then this is going to give us the response. And using this response, what we're going to do is we're going to say response.json, just like we did earlier. And we're going to set the people value to the response.data.results. Because the response has a data value that's an object that has a few different properties on it. The results array is the actual results from the API call, and that's what we want. We'll also have a success message that says successfully fetched data. And then we'll also have maybe the URL just to kind of show you the request.url that we used. And then in the catch block, if there is an error, we can also return something to the client. So let's go ahead and make this return something as well. So we can say response.json, and we can just say error fetching from API. Okay, that looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. And now when we call the app.get/people, when we make our API call, this is going to execute. We're going to get the response, and we're going to return that same object, but now we're going to have data that's coming back from a real API. So to test this out, I'm going to go back here, and we're going to go back to our directory where we were working before, and we're going to run amplify push. And now you see that we have an update to our main app Lambda function. And are we sure we want to continue? We'll go ahead and choose yes. And this is going to go ahead and deploy our changes to our backend. While that's happening, let's open our React application to kind of look at how we might interact with this data and actually list it out into our screen. So we're going to use a hook called UseState, which is pretty easy to kind of get up and running with. It allows us to kind of have some local state. And what we're going to do is we're going to say UseState. And we're going to set that to people. And I guess we also need an updater, I think. So people, update people. And we'll set that to use states and pass in an empty array. And then in our actual app, instead of just rendering out that stuff, we can say people.map. We can return a header with a person.name. And in call API, we'll just pass in this update people method, or we can actually take this async function and move it inside of here, where we can now call update people with this data.people. All right, so let's test this out. Looks like our resources have been updated, so we can now open up our app here. So you'll notice that when the app refreshes, we see that we have our data that's coming back from our app, and we're rendering it to our screen. We have Luke Skywalker, C-3PO, and all these people. And you'll notice that in our log now, we now have 10 people being logged out, and we have our success, and we have the URL that's set to /people. So from the command line, we're going to now look at how to invoke the Lambda function locally so we don't have to actually interact with it from our React application. To do so, we can run amplify invoke and then the name of the function that we'd like to invoke. So it would be something like amplify invoke and then our function name. So to get the function name, we can actually jump back to our React project, and we can go to the Amplify folder. We can find the backend and the function name. So for us, it's going to be main app Lambda. So we'll go here and we'll say main app Lambda. And this is going to go ahead and invoke our function. And if you remember correctly, when we went over this earlier, whoops, it looks like I have that wrong. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at that, see what's going on. We need to say amplify function invoke, I'm sorry. So amplify function invoke, and this is going to say main app Lambda. So if you remember correctly, what we looked at before when we created this Lambda function is it's actually running an Express server. So this is going to kick off an Express application, and it's going to be listening on a port. So it'll allow us to kind of interact with that port. So amplify function invoke main app Lambda, and it's going to go ahead and prompt us for a couple of things. First, it's going to go ahead and ask for the entry point, and that's index.js, and the name of the handler. And if you remember correctly, we do have an index.handler. So this is going to go ahead and invoke the function and run it on a port of our choice. So right now, that's actually going to be running on localhost 3000. So I went ahead and killed that because we also have our React application running on localhost 3000. So what I'd instead like to do would be to go into app.js. And if you scroll to the bottom, you'll see that we have this app.listen. And this way we can change the port to be 3001 so we can run both our React application and our Express application on the same machine without them conflicting. So what we're going to do now is go back, run this again, and this will go ahead and kick off everything we need. Actually, I'll go ahead and split the screen a little bit. So the name of the script is index, the function is handler. This will go ahead and kick off the Express app. So now we can start interacting with it. So what we want to do to test this out locally is we can start hitting it with curl requests. So we can say curl, and now we can say localhost 3001, and then slash the name of our endpoint. So we have people. Here you'll see that we actually do get the intended response. So we have this large response that has like the people's names and their other information as well. So that's how you would invoke that locally. And if you wanted to do other things, you could do post requests. You would just do -x post. All of the things that you would do typically from curl would be applicable locally. So if you wanted to send a body, you could do that as well. So now that we have the information about invoking these lambdas locally, let's now take a look at how we might add an authentication in front of our Lambda function. To do that, we first need an authentication service. So to add an authentication service, we can run amplify add auth. And this will go ahead and set up an authentication service for us. And it's going to be set up using Cognito. We're going to choose the default configuration, which will allow us to have username and email and password sign up. And we're going to set the username as what the user needs to actually sign in. We're going to ask for their email on signing up. And after this has been created, we'll run amplify push to go ahead and deploy this authentication service. And this is going to prompt us again to make sure that we'd like to continue. We're just going to choose yes. And now we're kind of good to go. So while this is deploying, we're going to go back to our React application. And in app.js, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and import the WidthAuthenticator. and this is going to be a higher order component from AWS Amplify React. And this is going to be the component that we're going to be using to put up an authentication in front of our main component. And now instead of exporting the class itself, we can now export the WidthAuthenticator as the default export. And we can also include greetings as the second argument, which is going to set us up with a sign out button as well as a greeting that has our username. So we set include greetings to true. The default export is the WidthAuthenticator. Now, after our application backend has been redeployed, the authentication service is going to be created. We're going to be able to start hitting the backend with new users, kind of signing them up, signing them in, etc. After the authentication service has been deployed, we'll get this message saying that all resources are updated in the cloud and we can now start using it. So I'm going to go ahead and reopen our React application. And we should now see that we have, when we refresh, we have this authentication flow that's sitting in front of our app. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create an account. And I'm going to go ahead and click Create an Account to create a new account. This is going to prompt us for a confirmation code. So this is going to be the multi-factor authentication piece of this. So in your email, you should now see a verification code. So we'll go ahead and enter that after it comes in. And we'll go ahead and confirm. Now we can sign in that our account has been created. And after we sign in, we're now authenticated. So if we refresh, we're going to stay signed in. So now what we're going to do is create an endpoint that only allows authenticated users to access it. And we're going to test it out. So I'm going to say Amplify configure API. And this is going to allow us to add a new endpoint. The endpoint that we're going to work with is that /items endpoint. And we can now choose the REST API that we already have. And I'm going to click Add Another Path. And I'm going to take the default of /items, and I'm going to use the function that we already have in our Amplify project. And this is going to be the main applet Lambda. So on restrict API access, I can now choose yes, and I want to allow authenticated users only to access this. And I can now only give authenticated users read access if I would like. So I'll go ahead and choose read, create, update, and delete for authenticated users. We'll go ahead and give them all access. And when we're asked for another path, we'll go ahead and choose no. So now we've updated our resource locally. We can run Amplify push, but before we do that, let's actually go and take a look at our code for this endpoint and maybe add another piece of information to kind of return some other data from it. So if we go to the Amplify folder and we open this app.js file, we'll see that we already have this app.get/items endpoint created. Let's go ahead and return one more item from here. And I mentioned earlier that the request has an request.api gateway part of the request object. It's the API gateway object. Let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. So I'm going to call this API gateway, and I'm going to say request.api gateway. And I'm going to say I want the request.api gateway.event, because the event is kind of the information that we're interested in. This is going to have the information around the user, whether or not they were logged in. There should be some information there. So for the response.json, I'm going to go ahead and return that. And then we're also going to have a quick look at how to post. So we're going to do an app.post. And we're also going to return the success message. We're going to have a body. And we're also going to have the URL. So here we're kind of like looking at that request.body, request.url. So this way, when we pass something to the items endpoint, it should be available in the body. So if I go ahead and save that, I run Amplify push again. This will go ahead and deploy that new updated backend with the new changes to both our API and our Lambda function. And while that's deploying, let's go back to our code. And now that we've updated our API, we have a new endpoint of /items. So let's log out the response from that items endpoint real quick to take a look at what that looks like. So we have all this stuff going on. Let's go ahead and create a couple of new API calls. We're going to call this item data, and we'll say api.get, and then we'll do /items. And I'll log out the item data. And then also I'll have another one called post data. And this is going to be us posting. And this is going to be /items. But we're going to pass in a third argument, which is going to be the parameters. So this is going to be the parameters that we're going to be passing in, which is going to contain the body. And it's going to be something like basic, like hello world. So let's go test this out. But before we do so, I think I need to change one thing in the params argument here. The body needs to be an object. So for the body, I'm going to give this a greeting, and that greeting is going to now be the string hello world. So what we basically have going on here, again, is the three API calls. We have a get, a post, and then we have a get on another item. So we have a get/people, a get/items, and a post for /items. We're passing in the params that has the body object with a greeting. So what we're going to do is we'll go back to Chrome, and when we refresh, we should now see 3 successful API calls. So here we have our original data that has, our Star Wars API information. We now have our second API call, which is the item data, which has the API gateway event that has all the information that would be coming through the event argument. And then finally, we have the post data, which we sent through as an API.post. And here we have the body, and the body contains a greeting. And this is the message that we sent through in the params object when we did the API.put. So this is kind of giving you a good idea of how you might access unique identifiers, again, for doing things like user authorization and fine-grained access controls. And also, if you wanted to send arguments into some type of database or something like that, you can send that in API.post. It would be available on the body argument. So now that we have all of that going, that's kind of the main things that we wanted to touch on. Let's now try to hit that API, that authenticated API from a curl command, and see how that would work, if we can actually get it to work. So what we want to do is we want to do Amplify Function Invoke, and we're going to go ahead and invoke the Lambda function that's part of our project. which is the main app Lambda. And now we can say curl. Go ahead and get this running. So if we curl people, actually I need to actually do this a little bit differently. Localhost 3001/people actually. So we see that we have our data coming back from the /people API. Let's try to invoke the protected API /items and see what happens. You'll notice that we do not successfully invoke this Lambda function. Instead, we get a pretty big error message back, basically saying we can't do this. So we can invoke /people, but we can't invoke /items. That's because people is now an open API, whereas items was a protected authenticated API. So now that we've kind of gone through everything, let's look at how to delete and kind of break down the project that we've created so far. One way would be to say amplify remove, and then we can start listing the different services. So we might want to say amplify remove function or something like that. And depending on the dependencies between the different resources, we could be able to remove things that aren't dependent on others. But since the function is dependent on the API or vice versa, actually, we can't remove the function until we remove the API. So what we're going to do is say amplify remove API. We'll go ahead and remove that main app API, and now we can say amplify remove function. And we can now choose the function that we'd like to remove. And if we want to actually just delete the entire project, we can just say amplify delete, and this will go ahead and tear down and delete the entire project. So this is going to go ahead and delete all of the resources, and all we're going to be left with is the React application that we created earlier. So that's the end of the demo. Really, we went over quite a bit today, but if you'd like to learn more, I would suggest looking at these three resources here. The AWS Amplify docs go really in depth into the API category and also the function category. We have the AWS Amplify community that we launched recently that outlines a lot of different community blog posts and example projects. So you can go there and kind of look and find stuff that wasn't written only by us, but by other people in the community. And then I have a tutorial that kind of goes along with what we've done today. If you want to see a tutorial written on Medium, it's called Serverless Functions in Depth. It's available on the A Cloud Guru Medium publication, and it's called, if you just Google for Serverless Functions in Depth, it should come up for you. So that concludes the screencast. Thank you for watching. I suggest if you're interested in this stuff and you want to interact with me and ask me any questions, you can follow me on Dabbit3 on Twitter, and I'd be happy to help you out. And you'd see a lot of interesting stuff coming from me about serverless and serverless functions and serverless GraphQL and all types of stuff. So thanks for watching, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.